Inside of today's video, we're going to be ranking all 128 star powers in the game in a tier list so you guys know which star powers to not buy and which star powers to buy because of how expensive they are in the game right now. But without further ado, let's jump right into it. So first off, we have a Shelly's star power. So Shell Shock, I think, is actually the longest slow duration in the game. Correct me if I'm wrong, but a really good star power to have with Shelly. It combines really well with Clay Pigeons. And then Band-Aid is actually pretty underrated. You know, it's not the strongest star power for Shelly, but in game modes and situation where Shelly might not be strong, you know, non-grassy maps, Band-Aid's actually pretty underrated. So for me, I'm putting Shell Shock into the A tier and then Band-Aid into the B tier. Next up, we have Nita star power. So the first one, Bear With Me, actually used to be really strong when it was first buffed a couple of years ago now. As time has gone on, it's kind of got power crept a bit and still just a bit lackluster, whilst Hyperbet is really strong in heist, but only really usable in heist. And for those reasons, I have to put both of these star powers in the B tier because one is really situational to one game mode, whereas one is just okay across the board. Next up, we have Colt star powers. First one is Slick Boots, gives you increased movement speed, only really good in a few scenarios, but and then Magnum Special not only increases the range, but also increases the bullet speed, so it makes it a lot easier to hit your shots consistently. I like both of these star powers. A lot of it can come down to personal preference. For me, I'm always using Magnum Special, so I have to put it in the A tier. It's just so good at just hitting shots a lot easier. And then if you want to be focusing more on your movement, then Slip Boots will be the better star power, but it has to be in the B tier. So now moving on to Bull, he has two okay star powers. The first one is Berserker. It seems to be really good in heist. At lower levels, you're going to get a lot of value out of its star power, but as you climb the rankings, Tough Guy is by far the better star power for me. Keeps you alive and really annoying to kind of take down the Bull when it's got this star power activated. So for me, Berserker has to be somewhere in the C or D tier just because I don't really get the most value out of it, even though it sounds good in its core. But Tough Guy has to be an A/B tier just because of how well it keeps Bull alive. So next up, we have Brock's star powers. So the first one is more rockets. You get extra rockets within your super, can be sometimes good, but a lot of times you might actually end up missing your super. And then we have a rocket number 4, which is actually really good in heist, but then a lot of times you don't actually end up reloading that 4th rocket. So both star powers are pretty situational and don't actually improve Brock too much. So for me, I'll probably put rocket number 4 in the B tier, maybe C tier, and then more rockets in the C tier. Has potential to be a little bit stronger, but I just feel like a lot of times you end up missing your super with Brock. Now moving on to El Primo. So both his star powers are pretty useful overall, but when you look at them at face value, they don't actually improve El Primo too much. It can definitely be used without them. So El Fuego will give you that extra damage over time, and then Meteor Rush will give you that extra speed once you do land with your super, but still I feel like both of them is pretty situational. It just depends on what you prefer. So for me, I'd actually put both of these in a C or B tier just because, you know, they're pretty useful, but they don't actually improve his kit too much. Next up, we have Barley's star powers. So medical use, he regains 400 HP every time he shoots, and then extra nostrils gives you that extra damage. For me, I think it's pretty simple. If you're facing off against an enemy thrower, medical use would be a little bit better, but overall, extra nostrils is going to give you a lot more value because you really need that extra damage with Barley, or else he gets overrun. So for me, I'll put medical use in the B tier, but maybe be A tier if Barley was a little bit better in the meta, and then extra nostrils has to be A because I feel like you can't really play without it because it just doesn't have the damage. Now moving on to Poco's star powers. The Capo used to always be the go-to star power. It's really strong, but now since the damage buff, since a few updates ago, everyone uses Screeching Solo. Poco is a lot more aggressive, and this allows him to confirm kills a lot easier. So for me and how you play Poco in this meta, Screeching Solo has to be an A tier star power and the Capo B tier, but both of them are really good. So next up, we have Rosa. So the first star power is the go-to star power, Plant Life. Gives you the extra 200 healing every second whilst you're in a bush. Can be a really good counter to some poison characters like Crow, for example, because you'll be healing up whilst they're dealing that poison tick. And then Thorny Gloves, only really obviously useful when you have a super, but that's actually pretty rare a lot of times. So for me, a Plant Life has to be in the A tier. I always use it. Rosa, it's super helpful. Then Thorny Gloves, I don't know, me personally, I just can't get value out of his star power. Now moving on to Jesse's star powers. First one, Energize, is going to be used 100% of the time. Really good star power, allows you to of course heal up your turret, but not only that, it will then waste the enemy ammo because they have to spend more ammo trying to defeat your turret. And then Shocky is just never used. It's just terrible. So that's why I'm putting Energize into the A tier, really strong with Jesse's build. And then Shocky 100% in the F tier. Next up, we have Dynamite's star powers. The first one, Dyna Jump, it's just absolutely useless now, especially since they changed Dynamite's attack speed. You can't double jump or triple jump anymore, and it was just useless anyways, in my opinion. And then Demolition, it allows you to one-shot so many different brawlers and allows you to be a lot more of a threat. So for me, Dyna Jump has to be into the F tier. There's just no use for it in today's meta. And then Demolition has to be in the A tier. So good at countering the brawlers that Dynamite counters. Next up, we have Tick's star powers. So the first one is Well Oiled. This complements Tick so well. One of the best star powers in the game easily, especially against enemy throwers, allows you to win that interaction. Then Automatic is still a pretty decent star power because of just how slow Tick's reload speed is, but it's definitely overshined by Well Oiled. So for me, Well Oiled has to be in the S tier. So good for Tick. And then Automatic probably in the C/B tier. Next up, we have 8-bit star power. So the first one is going to be Boosted Booster. It gives you extra range to your turret, but an extra 15% damage on top of your super. It's just really good. For some reason, I just feel like I completely melt with 8-bit whenever I use that star power when plugged in. It's really good. Used to be one of the best star powers in the game, but I feel like as time has gone on, people have realized how good Boosted Booster is. So for me, I actually really like both these star powers. I actually prefer Boosted Booster for the most part, maybe except for Gem Grab where I would use plugged in. So I'd actually have to put both of these in the A tier, but I would prefer Boosted Booster. Now moving on to Rico's star powers, starting off with Super Bouncy. So this is a star power which 100% of pros use. It's really good, again, that extra damage, especially on confined areas or maps with a lot of walls on them. You're going to get a lot of value out of Super Bouncy. It's going to be hard for the enemies to deal with. And then Robo Retreat used to be really good before Bouncy Castle was introduced, but I just feel like it's a bit counterintuitive. You don't really get value with this gadget, with this star power, because you want to be popping that gadget as soon as you're low, and then that removes the star powers. So for me, Robo Retreat is pretty pointless. I don't think I've seen any pro player use it. For me, Super Bouncy has to be in the A tier. I use it all the time with Rico, and then with the other star power, probably C or D tier. Maybe a little bit underrated, but it's just never picked. Next up, we have Daryl's star powers. So Steel Hoops is a really strong star power, allows you to get a lot of kills because you get that extra shield when you do finish your roll. Whereas Rolling Reload, it sounds pretty good, but for the most part with Daryl, you end up rolling when you have full ammo. By the time you've used up all your ammo, this star power is only going to help you probably reload maybe 1 ammo, maybe 2 maximum. I feel like it's only really useful in Heist, but still I'd probably prefer Steel Hoops in Heist. So for me, Steel Hoops has to be an A tier star power. I use it pretty much all of the time. Rolling Reload, I do actually end up using it in Heist, but still it's not really too beneficial. Next up, we have Penny's star powers. So both Penny's star powers are pretty underwhelming. Doesn't actually really improve Penny too much. The first one, it gives it an extra spread for coins after you hit an opponent, which sounds okay, but I don't think I really got any value out of it whatsoever. And then Master Blaster can be sometimes good if an aggro brawler is on top of you like a Mortis or a Buzz, but still you have to sacrifice your turret and can sometimes be a little bit awkward. So for me, I'd actually have to put both of these star powers in his C tier. Like, they help improve her a little bit, but not too much to really warrant the 2000 price tag. Next up, we have Cole. So his star powers are pretty useful. Power Throw, only 10% faster, but you definitely feel the difference. Only really used and competitive on the more long range maps, maybe on Bounty, or if you're against a lot of brawlers that will cancel out your super. But for me, Protective Pirouette is one of the best star powers in the game. You can just absolutely shred pretty much every single brawler in the game, and without its star power, you can't go aggressive whatsoever with Cole. So Power Throw has to be in the B/A tier. It's a pretty decent star power, but the other star power is just used so much more, and you can just be so aggressive with his star power. So next up, it is Jackie. So Jackie's star powers are pretty useful overall. Counter Crusher allows you to be really close to the opponents, and when you do, they will actually deal a percentage of the damage they dealt to you back to them, which is really strong because Jackie, you know, in close range is really dangerous. Then Hardy Hard Hat can sometimes be okay, but overall, I just feel like you need Counter Crusher because it changes a lot of engagements and actually allows you to get the kill. So for me, I'd put Counter Crusher probably in the A/B tier, and then Hardy Hard Hat just because I don't really see anyone use it in the C tier. Next up, we have Gus's star power. So the first one, Health Bonanza. It seems pretty good and increased healing by 100%, but with how you play Gus, the ghosts aren't really around the map too often. They're always in awkward spaces, and for the most part, you're actually going to be using your first gadget to explode the ghosts and get kills, so it doesn't really make sense to use the first star power. The second star power is really strong in conjunction with aggro brawlers, but not only that, it actually gives Gus a good good damage boost if he puts the shield on himself, so a really good star power to have. So for me, I'm putting the first star power in the D tier, just don't really see the point in using it, and then the second star power probably in the A or B tier. I think it's a really strong star power. Next up, we have Bo's star power. So the first one, Circling Eagle, used to be really strong when there was a lot of grassier maps in the game right now, but still pretty underrated. It's actually used more often than you really realize. And then Snare a Bear, of course, it's really strong. If the enemy actually goes onto the mine, you're basically guaranteed a kill because it will stun them for a few seconds. So for me, Circling Eagle has to be in the C tier, and then Snare a Bear into the A tier. Next up, we have Em's star powers, where this one's always been a good debate in terms of which one's the better star power. Bad Karma is used by a lot of people as well. Most people do end up using Hype because there's a value you can get with a super with M's, but both of them are just as good as each other. So for that reason, I'd actually put both of them probably towards the A tier. If I was a bit more biased towards myself, probably Hype A tier and Bad Karma B tier. Next up, we have Stu's star power. So Zero Drag, it feels really fun to play, but actually isn't used whatsoever in competitive, whereas Gaza Heal is just super strong. 400 healing for every single super. It just combines so well with Stu, and it's definitely needed for his build. So for Gaza Heal, it absolutely has to be in the S tier. It's completely made for Stu, makes him so much better. And then Zero Drag probably in the C tier. It's pretty useful overall, but Gaza Heal just overshines it so much. Next up, we have Piper. So Ambush used to be really strong a few years ago, and then Power 11 came, so it got an indirect nerf by just people getting more HP. And then also the shield gear as well. It's just made Ambush a lot less impactful, if you get what I mean. Before, you could easily two-tap people, but Snappy Sniping is just so strong. You can use it everywhere. You don't have to be in a bush to get that extra ammo, and of course it pairs pretty well with her other gadget as well. So for me, I'd actually put Ambush in the C tier, probably even D tier. I just never even consider using it personally. And then Snappy Sniping, I actually put towards the S or A tier. I just think it complements Piper so well. So now moving on to Pam. So Mama's Hug just feels really lackluster, only really good in the weekend event modes, to be honest, whereas Mama's Squeeze allows Pam to be really aggressive with her super and allows for a lot of aerial denial. So I'd put Pam's first star power in the D tier, maybe even F tier, and then Mama's Squeeze probably towards the B tier. I think it can be pretty powerful. Next up, we have Frank's star power. So Power Grab, you know, feels pretty good, but it's actually pretty rare to really get it throughout the game. It's hard to confirm a kill with Frank sometimes, especially against those high skill players. But as Sponge, you're guaranteed to get value out of his star power all of the time, making him just so tanky. So for me, I'll put Sponge in the B tier, and then probably Power Grab in the C tier, just because you don't really get it too often. So next up, we have BB's star powers. So there's always a little bit of a debate in terms of which one is the better star power. I see most people often than not in competitive use Batting Stance, just because it allows you to tank a little bit more whilst you actually get close to the opponent. But Home Run can also be a lot better on maybe a more free map where there's a lot more space to get used out of that star power. But for most part, Batting Stance is going to be the better star power. But for me, both of these star powers are really useful, especially when you consider BB without them. So Batting Stance has to be in A tier, and then Home Run probably towards the B/A tier. So now moving on to B. So Insta B-Load, it's a good star power. It gives you another charge shot if you miss the first one. But the main reason why B is actually meta right now is because people discovered how good Honeycomb is. It's definitely the better star power overall. Every single pro player uses this one, so it has to be the better out of the two. So for me, Honeycomb has to be in the A tier, just because of how strong she's been since people have started to use this star power. Then Insta B-Load is still a pretty good star power, but because of a difference in use rate, it has to be below beatable. So next up, we have Nani's star power. So the first one is Autofocus, gives you an extra 1600 damage on maximum distance with Nani's Peep. It used to help a lot, but right now I just don't think it really benefits Nani too much. And then Tempered Steel, it works really well with a teleport gadget, but still you end up feeding the enemy a lot from this star power. So for me, Autofocus probably has to be maybe C tier or B tier. I don't think it really helps out Nani too much, but at least it allows you to get some kills with Nani. And then Tempered Steel, probably D/C tier. It's actually really good at basically you're not going to die whilst you have that super active, but it still feeds the enemy super a lot. So now moving on to Edgar. I dread talking about this brawler a lot because there's a lot of controversy around Edgar, but for me, both star powers just feel a bit meh. Hard landing can be good to confirm kills, but then you've got to consider the quicker you kill people with its star power, the less you're actually going to charge back your super. So me a little bit counterintuitive, whilst Fisticuffs allows you to heal a lot more, but also builds up your super much quicker to cycle. So for me, I'd probably have to put both of these star powers probably in the B tier, but maybe if Eggo was a little bit better, Fisticuffs could definitely be an A tier star power. Now moving on to Griff's star powers. So Keep the Change used to always be the better star power. It's still pretty decent overall, but then they've reworked Griff, so you got a lot less value out of his star power, and Business Resilience has just been the main reason why Griff like skyrocketed to the top of the meta. Being able to heal every 2 seconds, especially when you're low HP, you get so much value out of it, and the main reason why he's so strong right now. So Keep the Change has to be probably in the B or C tier. Definitely does help him out a little bit, but Business Resilience, one of the best star powers in the game, has to be S tier. Next up, we have Grom's star powers. So Foot Patrol is just terrible. You only get a little bit of additional movement speed when you have your super, but with Grom, you want to get that super out as quickly as possible, so you're probably only going to benefit out of it a little bit throughout the game, whilst X Factor gives you a massive damage boost, an extra 30%. It allows you to 2-shot, 3-shot so many different brawlers in the game. So for me, Foot Patrol has to be an F tier star power. You don't get any value out of it, whilst X Factor, you get a lot of value out of it, especially now that he's been buffed with his projectile speed. It just combines with his mechanics really well. So next up, we have Bonnie. So the first star power allows you to launch out of your cannon 36% longer. It feels good, but doesn't actually improve Bonnie too much, whereas Wisdom Tooth is one of the worst star powers in the game. You barely get any extra damage from it. So for me, I'd put Wisdom Tooth in the F tier, and then the other star power probably in the C tier. Doesn't really help out Bonnie too much. So now moving on to the mythics, we have a Mortis. So Creepy Harvest used to be a really strong star power. Doesn't really offer too much, only 1000 extra healing when you do kill someone, and Coiled Snake, you only get your dash 2 seconds faster, which doesn't really help him out too much. So I'm putting Coiled Snake in the D tier, and then Creepy Harvest in the B tier. Next up, we have Tara. So her first star power makes it so when you super, a little Tara Shadow comes out, which is 3000 HP and deals damage to the opponent, so it can be really good against single shot brawlers like Jean, for example. And then you have Healing Shade, so just like the other star power, when she just use super, a little Tara pet will come out and heal you up, which can get a lot of value out of it sometimes, but then often it can also get taken out quite quickly. So the Healing Pet is going into the A tier. You can get so much value out of this one, and then the other star power probably like a C tier, just because I feel like people just take it out too quickly. Next up, we have Jean. So we have Magic Puffs, which is pretty much one of the best star powers in the game. Easily gets so much value out of healing up your teammates around you. And then Spirit Slap is only really good in solo showdown, and still it doesn't really provide much else to Jean. So for me, Magic Puffs absolutely has to be S tier, one of the best star powers for sure. And then the brand new star power that got reworked, I still feel like it's going to be F or D tier. Like, at least you can use it in solo showdown, but then again, it doesn't really help him out too much. So next up is Max. So Supercharge is a really strong star power, often overlooked. I think it's one of the best just because it's a really good passive ability. With Max, you're always moving, so you're always cycling your super really well with this star power, whilst Runner Gun is only really needed when you're facing off against much tankier opposition, but still, Supercharge is going to be better pretty much all of the time. So because Max has one of the best supers, I have to put Supercharge in the S tier. I think it's such a strong star power to have to cycle your supers. It makes her much better than with Runner Gun, but Runner Gun's still pretty decent. I'd have to put it in the B tier. Next up is Mr. P. So both star powers for me are really lackluster. The first one, handled with care, you know, extra damage, you kind of read that, you think it's good, but it's only when the suitcase actually lands. So if you actually hit an opponent and then a suitcase lands, that's where the extra damage is, and you're not always going to hit that suitcase, if you get what I mean. It's a little bit awkward for me. Revolving door, you do get extra 20% HP and extra 30% damage, which is okay. So for me, I'd honestly consider putting Handle with Care in the F tier. You may sometimes get value with it, but I don't really get value too much with it. And then the next star power still doesn't really help him out too much. I'll probably put it near the C or B tier. You know, only an extra 20% HP is really not going to do much. So next up, we have Sprout. So both star powers are pretty useful. Overgrowth's pretty good, especially when you want some extra range. Every 5 seconds, your next attack will explode with a bigger radius, so of course increasing his range. And also you make it so you can actually shoot through walls with Sprout's attack. And whilst Photosynthesis gives him a shield whilst in grass, which can be useful on some grassy maps. So for me personally, I'd actually put Overgrowth towards the A or even B tier. I think it really helps him in 1v1s to confirm kills and whatever else. Photosynthesis seems good. It's only really good against other thrower matchups because you don't really need that extra HP too often as a thrower. Now moving on to Byron. So Malaise is a really good star power, especially against those tanky units. So basically when you super someone, they will be healing up a lot less. Like, it's really noticeable, especially on those high HP brawlers. So it can be a really good counter to them, and also just healing compositions. Then Injection makes it so then you can shoot through your teammate and then potentially hit an opponent, or of course just pierce any object, which sometimes can be really beneficial. So for me, I'd have to put Melee's towards the A tier, just because when Byron was meta, Melee's just felt so strong for me personally. And then Injection, I don't think I've really ever used Injection, but it can definitely have its uses, especially if you pair it with like an 8-bit, for example, you can get a lot of value. So next up we have Squeak. So Chain Reaction is pretty good to bump up the damage with Squeak, but it's never really used. All of the time you pretty much want to use Super Sticky. Really good if you hit your super onto an opponent. It will slow in 4 seconds, allow you to chain your shots a lot easier, and then work your way to another super. So for me, I would look to put Super Sticky probably in the A or S tier. I think it's really good for Squeak. Doesn't really have the best base stats, but his stop power really helps him confirm kills. And then for Chain Reaction, probably more so like a D or C tier. It's never really used often. Lastly, for the mythics, we have a Grace. So with Fake Injury, you only get a damage reduction when you're full HP, which to be honest, you're not really full HP too often in Brawl Stars. Maybe in game modes like Knockout you might be, but it's pretty hard to always be full HP to get value out of that. And then Noob Perspective is pretty good if you're looking to constantly go over the teleport. Again, 1000 HP, not only for you, but also your teammates. So for me, I'd have to put Fake Injury in the D tier. Don't really get too much value out of it. And then the other star power, like, it's not necessarily always needed, but it's pretty good to have. So probably a B or A tier. I think it's pretty solid overall. So next up, we have Spike. So Fertilize used to be a pretty good star power. I feel like the healing's a little bit too less of what I would want it to be, but still pretty good, especially against countering brawlers like Sam, for example. Really good in that matchup. And then Curveball is just strong overall, extends his range really easily. You're able to hit shots around walls so easily as well. And you combine this with Vision Gear, it makes him really dangerous. For me, I'd have to put Curveball, unfortunately, in the S tier. You know, you can dodge Curveball, there are ways around it, but I just think it makes him such a strong brawler. And then Fertilize, I'd have to put in a B tier. It's starting to actually become pretty strong within this meta. So next up, we have Crow. So Extra Toxic is the star power, which pretty much everyone uses. And it's really strong because every single enemy that is poisoned, they deal 25% less damage, which is pretty good. Then Carrying Crow is somewhat underrated, especially with the brand new Mythic gear, but it's still underused and only really the most useful in heists. For me, Extra Toxic has to be in the A tier, always used with Crow. Then Carrying Crow, I never really use it too often, could be underrated, but just because of its use rate, I have to put it in the C tier. Next up, we have Leon. So Smoke Trails is only really often usable in the showdown, but also in really open maps like Shooting Star. Does give you an extra speed boost and can work well with his brand new Mythic gear. But 9 times out of 10, you want to use Invisi-Heal. It's so good. Healing 1000 per second really allows Leon to be super aggressive and keep in the fight. So Invisi-Heal has to be within the S tier. Such a strong star power to have. And then Smoke Trails probably towards the C, but definitely could be underrated with a Mythic. Now moving on to Sandy. So although Sandy is one of the worst brawlers in the game, I think it's got one of the best star powers in the game with Root Sands. So the way you play Sandy with a super especially, Root Sands just makes it so, especially in bushes, you can also scout out the enemies if you throw your super on them. But the most important thing is you stop their health regen. It is so annoying to face off against, and that's why I think it's one of the best star powers. Healing Winds is actually pretty good as well, but pretty much all of the time you want to use Root Sands just to scout out the opponents. So for me, I'd have to put Root Sands toward the A or even S tier, because I feel like I just can't play Sandy without his star power. It just builds in with his play so easily. And then Healing Winds probably towards the B tier, just because it isn't often used. So next up, we have Amber. So Wild Flames is definitely the better star power. You combine this with 5 starters and you can just keep cycling your supers over and over again. And the best thing about it for sure in this meta is her super, being able to confirm kills with it and also break open the grass is the main reason why Amber's used in this meta. Whilst the second star power, you know, it sounds pretty good, but just overall, you only really need the reload gear, and it's probably overkill. I just find it's awkward because often I end up just shooting my own puddle, and then I can't get any use of this stuff. So for me and many other pro Ambers, I think Wild Flames is a must for her. S tier for sure. It really does help her out. And then for Amber's other star power, you know, it feels like you should be able to get a lot of value out of it, but I don't really like it too much. So D or C tier, kind of conflicted. Probably have to put it in a C tier. Now moving on to Meg. So you got Force Field, which is one of the best star powers in the game, and then you have Heavy Metal, which is pretty pointless. So with Force Field, you get 35% shield for 30 seconds, which is just so long. It's literally the most value out of any star power in the game. And then Heavy Metal, you only deal damage to people which are literally on top of you. But with Meg, you only really want to be in and around people when you have your super whilst in Meg. For me, Force Field absolutely has to be S tier because she's so squishy as well. It really helps her out. And then the other star power has to be in the F tier. It's terrible. And lastly, for the legendary brawlers, we have Chester. So Bella Mania is literally such a good star power. it should be baseline because you get an extra stage, extra DPS, you know, it's no bueno. And then sneak peek, you know, it sounds good when you read the text, but I haven't really found a scenario where it really helps me out. But not only that, you lose out on the extra DPS because of the other star powers, so it's just no point even using it. So Bella Mania 100% has to be S tier. It literally should be baseline. Sneak peek has to be F tier. Just find zero value out of it. Now moving on to the chromatics, starting off with Gale. So Blustery Blow is a really good star power, especially against tanks. If you can cycle your super enough, you can just stun lock people, of course. Now Gale has been nerfed, it's not as strong, whilst Freeze and Snow is definitely really underrated, especially on those open maps. You can just keep up the consistent damage. For me, I'd have to put both of these star powers in the A tier. Beforehand, I would have actually put Blustery Blow as an S tier, but just because of how long it takes him to cycle his super, he isn't able to use his star powers much. Now moving on to Surge. So both of these star powers are completely different. Turbomax is only usable in Showdown, but still it's just pretty terrible. There's only probably a few scenarios out of like tens of thousands where it's useful, and then Serve Ice Cold is literally needed for Surge, or else he's terrible. For me, Turbomax absolutely has to be F tier, a terrible star power, and then Serve Ice Cold has to be S tier. You definitely need it with Surge. So now moving on to Colette. So she actually has two really good star powers. I feel like without both of these star powers, Colette is really unusable. So Push It enables her, so a lot of brawlers you can two-shot and then use super to kill them. So Push It literally like kind of stun locks them in a way and forces them to receive that super damage. And then Mass Tax is really good, especially against the high safe. You know, if you hit the high safe, you can get that extra shield, and it's just really valuable overall, just keeping her alive really well. So for that reason, I'd have to put both of these star powers in the A tier. Definitely really useful overall for her game. Now moving on to Lou's star powers. So Super Cool is only really effective when, of course, the opponents are on his super, but a lot of times you end up just freezing them anyway. It doesn't really help too much. Then Hypothermia, it is a pretty strong star power, but a lot of times, again, with Lou, you're going to end up just freezing them pretty quickly, so you don't really always get the most value out of this one. So for me, I'd have to put Super Cool towards the C or the D tier. You don't really get the most value out of it. Then Hypothermia is pretty decent, but again, it's pretty hard to see the true value. So now moving on to Ruff. So Air Superiority is one of the best star powers in the game. It enables him to break open the map with his super, and it's literally one of the main reasons why he's picked so often. So of course, you have to choose his star power. Whilst Field Promotion, it used to be good back when it was first released a year ago or so, but I've never really seen anyone use it to its true potential anymore. So for me, the first star power definitely has to be in the S tier. It's so strong with Ruff, being able to break open the map. And then his second star power isn't really used too often, maybe has potential on defensive maps, but I just never see it. So next up we have Belle. So Belle's first star power is pretty strong just because Belle isn't the most tankiest of brawlers, so an extra bit of shield when you hit a shot allows you just to be even more aggressive and stay in the fight. Whilst grounded, I don't think I've ever seen anyone use this star power. It's completely pointless. So for me, positive feedback has to be towards the A or even B tier. Pretty strong star power overall, and grounded, of course, in the F tier. Now moving on to Buzz. So the first star power enables him to stun an extra 0.5 seconds, which sometimes can be okay, but because his automatic charging circle is really small, eyes sharp, you just need it pretty much all of the time, because without it, I just feel like Buzz is so vulnerable. So for me, Eyes Sharp has to be an S tier star power. I just can't play Buzz without it. And then his first star power doesn't really help him out too much. I'd have to put it towards the D tier. Next up, we have Ash. So first Bash star power, I feel it's so strong. It enables him to start his rage cycle, and you can just keep going in raging, and that's obviously the best thing about Ash, because without his rage, he doesn't get the speed and the damage, whilst Mad as Heck can be pretty good if you start cycling with the rats and whatever else, but it can be pretty hard to ramp up with his star power. For me, I'd have to put first Bash towards the A tier. Definitely a star power you need to have with Ash, and then his second star power is still pretty useful and can get you that extra DPS. So next up, we have Alola's star power. So Improvise is pretty good. It allows you to get a lot more damage, 30% extra damage when she's down to her last ammo, which she just tend to kind of play like that with Lola now because of that star power. While Sealed with Kiss, it sounds pretty good, but only 100 healing, and you've got to have your clone kind of behind you to get that healing. So for me, Improvise is a good star power, but you can definitely live without it with Lola, so I'd have to put it in the B tier. Then Sealed with a Kiss, I just feel like it's a little bit too awkward, so I've got to put it towards a D for me personally. Now moving on to Fang. So both star powers can be useful in some ways, but don't actually improve Fang too much. Fresh Kicks, you get your super back instantly if you kill someone with your super, but then your super doesn't actually do too much damage, so it's a really small threshold to get your super back. It can be pretty hard to pull off, whilst Divine Souls will give you that extra damage reduction every 3 seconds, but still doesn't offer the most benefit. So for me, both of these star powers should be in and around the B/C tier, just because they're decent, but don't really improve him too much. Next up, we have Eve. So this star power switches the positions of the eggs. So normally it's the small egg first and then the big one last. Why is this important? Because the big egg does the most damage. So with this star power, the big egg will be shot first. So of course you'll be getting more damage quickly, but it's still not really needed with Eve. And same goes with the Happy Surprise. Used to be the best star power in the game, but still a little bit awkward and can be really hard to hit the large egg sometimes. So I'd have to put Happy Surprise on the D tier. Just rarely ever hit that big egg to get that extra hatchling. And then Unnatural Order, you don't really need it, but it does feel pretty good with it. Next up, we have Janet's Statue. Makes it so when you super, you can see enemies whilst they're in the bushes. Can be really useful on some really grassy maps, whereas Vocal Warm-Up makes it so she'll basically attack at longer ranges much quicker, and is definitely needed for Janet. So for me, Vocal Warmth has to be towards the S or the A tier, because you pretty much need to use it all the time with her. And then grassy maps, you can definitely opt for the other star power. Next up, we have Otis. So Otis's first star power makes it so his mute lasts 1 second longer. Doesn't really help him out too much, whilst ink refills, just like Bellomania with Chester, it just needs to be baseline. It's so strong. Without it, Otis is one of the worst brawlers in the game. So definitely ink refills has to be the S tier. It literally should be a baseline star power. Whilst the other star power doesn't really make too much sense, but maybe if other things worked around could be a little bit better, but should be towards the D tier. Don't get much value with it. Next up, we have Hearty Recovery with Sam. So you can recover 20% of your missing HP every time you pick up your super. It just really works with him. Without it, I don't think Sam would be one of the best brawlers in the game. Remote Recharge, I don't know, it's just so weird and pointless. So this one's really easy. Hearty Recovery has to be an S tier star power. So strong with it, Sam. And then the other star power is literally pointless, should be F tier. So next up, we have a Buster. So Buster's first star power only really works when your teammates are around you, and you get that extra 15% damage. Can actually be a little bit beneficial because Buster has received huge damage nerfs. But Kevlar Vest is just so strong. You're immune to knockbacks, slows, and stuns, whilst in your super, it can be really strong. So for me, Kevlar Vest could have absolutely been an S tier brawler, but because of his super duration going from 6 seconds to 3 seconds, I don't think you actually get too much value out of it right now. So B tier is probably fair, and then his other star power, it's hard to get value with that one as well, so C tier. And finally, moving on to Mandy's star powers. Starting off with In My Sights. So In My Sights makes it so when you get that extra range, you'll be shooting 20% faster. This is so strong, one of the best star powers in my opinion. Without it, Mandy would be terrible. And then the other one, when you're focused, you get a 20% shield, which doesn't really help you out at all. So for me, I'd actually put In My Sights as an S tier star power. I think it's so strong for Mandy. Makes you able to hit shots so easily, especially on maps like Shooting Star. Whilst the shield star power is really weird and awkward, I'd probably put it towards a C or D tier. Alright guys, it's going to be it for today's video. Hope you enjoyed this one. So I think for the most part, this is really accurate in terms of just how I feel whenever I'm playing without this star power or without this star power. It gives me an upper hand. The F tier especially just will give me no benefit whatsoever, whilst some of them D tier may be okay sometimes. C tier, in the odd chance I might switch to it, and then B tier and above are ones that you pretty much want to be using or buying with your brawlers. So that's going to be it for today's video. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and I'll see you guys next time.